Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to present to you today on the journey from Melon's V1 to V2. Um, and I've decided to use a little bit of an analogy today in terms of how I um, think about framing Melon. And I'm going to use Tetris as an analogy. So, Tetris, for pretty sure you all know what it is, but the reason I decided to use it as an analogy is because it's a really cool game which incentivizes you to put a lot of pieces to the puzzle together. And as the infrastructure players in DeFi start to think about doing that or start to actually do that, it's a really nice feeling to interconnect with other DeFi infrastructures and see the whole future of finance coming together. But one of the parts that I really like about this analogy is that every time you form a line in Tetris, you also see that layer of complexity removed. And I feel that that's really reflective of how kind of DeFi looks for the financial industry. Like we're just removing so many layers of complexity from traditional finance. And this is actually what we originally out to do in 2016 when I originally co-founded Melonport with Reto Trinkler. The vision was really to remove as much complexity from traditional finance and, of course, reap all the benefits of decentralized finance, the permissionless aspects, and the decentralization aspects as well. So really what I want to cover today is how well did Melon version 1 live up to the Tetris analogy? And then I want to take a look at what lessons we learned from that and how we're going to apply them or how we have applied them to our upcoming V2 release. But before we begin, I just want to give a couple of minutes reminder or debrief on what Melon is for those of you who may or may not be familiar with it. So Melon is a decentralized asset management protocol. It basically empowers asset managers or fund managers to customize and build and deploy a fund management strategy to the blockchain. It basically is easily customizable in the sense that you can predefine the rule sets by which you want your fund to run. You can predefine things like what management fee you want to charge, what performance fee you want to charge. You want to keep the fund open to everyone to invest or create a whitelist of investors that you want to invite into your fund. You can create risk management policies. So you can define rule sets like how much risk the fund is allowed to take, how many positions the fund is allowed to take, maximum concentration, etc. And the protocol really takes care of all the annoying administrative and operational aspects of a fund that nobody really wants to deal with unless they're really weird. So things like calculating the NAV of the fund, the net asset value, or the share price of the fund, things like calculating the management and performance fees and even distributing those fees, things like keeping tabs on positions of the fund and how they're changing, intraday P&L, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, if you think about this as problem and solution, the problem investment managers have today is that there's no easy way to scale their investing strengths and to interact with potential investors. And that's because it's really costly to set up a fund. It's around $100,000 as a one-off fee to probably get started, and probably $50,000 to $75,000 of running costs per year after that. It's very complicated. No one can give you all the answers. You have to go to a ton of different service providers, etc. And even once you finally get set up, and that setup process typically takes a few months, it's incredibly draining to keep up to date with all the operational administrative reporting that needs to be done to stay compliant. The solution we have is really removing the friction, allowing investment managers and their investors to focus purely on what they love doing, which is sourcing the best investment opportunities. And by contrast, it's really cheap because it's all done by smart contracts. Caveat, when gas prices are not too high, 95% reductions, at least compared to traditional space. It's a very simple process, and it's also very empowering. And it's empowering because you're essentially outsourcing or automating all the stuff you don't really want to do, and that you're able to focus on what you love and presumably also what you're really good at. So we've now talked about what Melon is and what it strives to be. So how well did we actually achieve this with V1? So for those who are not aware, or for context maybe, V1 was released in February 2019, and we launched a mainnet that was under the Melon port umbrella. And then we, I think, became the first DeFi protocol in history to decentralize our governance. And then we sort of, did kind of went our separate ways. And apart from being involved in the governance process, we were, kind of watching to see what would happen. And basically, nothing happened. There were pretty much no users in the first year. And really, it shouldn't have been a big surprise to us. Like we had a protocol that worked, but our first interface was, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it was practically unusable, very difficult to interact with, and almost impossible actually to have a smooth experience with. But if you think about how V1 performed compared to the traditional world, like we slowly made some improvements. And when I say we, in September last year, my new company, Avantegarde Finance, and Avantegarde Core made a proposal to the Melon Council DAO, and we proposed a new 3-year roadmap for the Melon protocol, and we actually put ourselves forward to become the lead developer of the Melon protocol. The Melon Council voted us in for that, and the first task we set out to do was start to try and improve on that user experience within V1. And we had a bit of success. It became usable. I wouldn't say it was easy to use, but it was usable. And when you compare it to what you could do with traditional funds, it was a huge improvement in the sense that you could now set up a fund in the space of 15 minutes by signing 9 transactions, customizing your preferences, and then signing 9 transactions on chain. And it worked. It, generally speaking, it wasn't like super smooth, but it worked. And the beautiful thing about it is that people, small to medium-sized managers who typically can't afford the high barriers to entry in the asset management space, were empowered and were able to start to think about their track records. But we did learn a few lessons from that sort of time. And the first lesson we learned was that fragmented and isolated workflow wasn't really optimal for trying to achieve the best user experience. So previously, we were kind of, front end was very segregated to back end. Communication channels weren't very clear within our team. And generally speaking, that there wasn't much interaction between the two, or coordination and synchronization between the two teams. And so as a result, we weren't always making the smart contract changes fast enough, or the relevant smart contract changes and necessary architectural changes to give users the experience that we strived for. So that was one lesson. Another lesson was our V1 was designed with a very rigid architecture and rigid contracts. So maybe to put this in a little bit of context, when we first provided our first roadmap in 2016 for V1, the DeFi space was very nascent. There weren't a lot of DeFi technologies out there. So when we tried to imagine what that roadmap could look like, it was basically set up a protocol that can handle the management of plain vanilla tokens or primitives. It should be able to calculate NAV, it should be able to deal with management performance fees, and it should be able to integrate with DEXs, because DEXs were the main kind of DeFi tool at that time. And then sort of this roadmap was set in stone. It was a promise made to token holders, and we sort of had to stick to it. But essentially what happened in the meantime is DeFi space exploded, and we had all sorts of new protocols that we were now kind of able to integrate with, or to imagine integrating with, things like borrowing and lending protocols, options, derivatives, synthetic products, and much more exciting stuff. And unfortunately, the V1 was designed with only DEXs in mind. So a nice example of that was that we could easily build an adapter to integrate with new DEXs that were coming up, like Uniswap, 0xV2, etc. But we were struggling, or it was impossible to integrate quickly protocols like Compound or Aave, etc. And so we really I guess learned the hard way from V1 in terms of what a good architecture should look like for a protocol like this. The third lesson we learned, and this was from our users, was that not having upgradability paths was a serious problem that hindered our managers or potential users. So their kind of perspective on this was that if I'm going to bother setting up a fund and building a track record, and then you're going to make a new release, in order for me to access the features of that new release, I have to shut down the fund. My investors have to redeem. I then have to recreate a new fund, and those investors have to invest in that fund again. And they basically said, this is basically sounds like a UX nightmare and a pain. So why don't you just call us when you have upgradability? So we took an unplanned turn when we realized this and decided that even though upgradability was quite a big challenge, we decided that we wanted to tackle this urgently for our next release. And so we extended the release cycle for V2 in order to include this. The fourth lesson we learned, and I think a lot of DeFi protocols learned this in the last few months, is that we were not well prepared for the high gas fees on Ethereum. We started off by saying to people that it was $40 to set up a new fund, and we massively reduced the barriers to entry, etc. Well, guess what? In August, I think it was around $3,000 to deploy a fund because of the huge spike in gas prices. And so, yeah, I think that was something that we definitely were very mindful of whilst designing V2. And the last but not least was that the user interface we have, even though I alluded to the fact that we went from unusable to usable, I wouldn't say today it's like intuitive and like easy to use. And this has actually come as a shock to me and my teammates sometimes, because we find it very easy to use, but then again, we spend our day and night on it. And so listening to what people are saying is also really important, and something that we have definitely learned from. So what have we done about these lessons, and how has V2 evolved? So the last few months we've been working pretty hard, I would say since March. Since April, maybe March, April, we've basically set out to pretty much rebuild version 2 from scratch to address many of these problems. And the first thing we've done is rework our workflow. We have a much more integrated workflow, much better communication lines. The front end team is talking continuously to the back end team. I'm the person who usually spends most of the time speaking to users. And so we are constantly discussing how things can improve and making sure that we are doing it in a live basis, so that the contract changes that need to be made to simplify the interface are being made with an understanding of why those changes are being made, and not just because someone is telling you to do them. The other change that we've made is changed our kind of rigid infrastructure into something that's much more flexible and extensible. So our V2 can now handle many different types of protocols. It's almost much easier now to build an adapter to connect to protocols that are different, and this should pave the way for much faster integrations going forward, and also shorter release cycles. So we're really excited about that. Because of the new architecture and the fact that it's so modular, this has also enabled us to implement upgradability patterns. And so we will have upgradability for V2, which we're really excited about. And I think some of our users are also very excited about that. And the fourth thing, how did we address the gas prices? Well, we basically spent a lot of time, and we did this several times, ruthlessly challenging every single contract and questioning whether certain things really needed to be there or not. And the result was actually ditching a lot of stuff that we previously thought was necessary and essential, and having a much, much lighter protocol as a result. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like on mainnet, our early testing suggests that deploying a fund to mainnet will consume about 1/40th of the gas costs that were required to deploy a fund on V1. So we're really excited about that. And last but not least, for the first time in our history, we have been conducting user interviews and working with a senior UX UI professional who has helped us completely revamp the interface and make it a lot more intuitive and user-friendly. So we're really excited about that. In terms of what features people can expect from V2, we've covered some of them, but we're aiming for a much larger asset universe, which has been a really big pushback from our users. And again, the adapted architecture will pave the way for that. We will be integrated with lending protocols. So that will be a first in the history of Melon. Funds will be able to deposit their assets into market-making pools as another source of revenue or as part of a new type of strategy. Funds will be upgradable. And currently, funds are all denominated in ETH. And this is a trickier asset to outperform. It's not always the asset people want to be benchmarked against. So for V2, we're also giving people the choice to choose what currency their fund is denominated in. As I mentioned earlier, the V2 protocol will also consume less gas, much less gas, and have a faster performance. And also, we will be enabling aggregated liquidity, which should also provide better execution for our managers and their investors. In terms of timeline, we are currently booked to start our audit at the start of November. Our best guess, although it's very hard to predict these things, is that the audit cycle will take 6 to 8 weeks. That's just based on past experience. We're hoping to release a private testnet beta in the middle of November, where certain users will be invited to help us test early and refine any parts that may not work and give us feedback. And we're still on track at the moment for a Q4 release, and we're hoping for middle of December for a mainnet release. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I just want to take 10 seconds to say that some of you may have followed this in the past couple of weeks, but Melon will also be undergoing a major rebrand. Unfortunately, BNY Mellon, one of the largest US banks and administrators, has been coming after certain individuals who are involved with the Melon project and threatening trademark infringement on those individuals. And so we have decided that it's probably not worth the time, effort, and money to fight such a big player in the space, and maybe we could actually benefit from a rebrand anyway at this time. So just wanted to mention that so that you are not confused or lost when looking for us. Just stay tuned for a rebrand in the next 3 to 4 weeks, and we hope that you'll continue to follow us. In the meantime, if you want to keep in touch with us, Twitter is usually the most active kind of social media forum for us. You can follow me or ask me any questions. You can follow Melon Protocol, which is the ecosystem of projects building around Melon as well as their community. Or you can follow my team and our company, Avantegarde Finance, which are the lead developer of the Melon Protocol. I think that's pretty much it for now. Thank you for listening.